Something horrible happened on my 13th birthday. That was 10 years ago now. It's funny how quickly time flies, but fearful memories can remain frozen within us. Memories we'd rather not remember. This is one of those memories. Like I stated, it was my 13th birthday, and my father and grandfather had gathered to hold a small party for me. They were all I had. I never knew my mother, and I didn't have any siblings. It was just the three of us. We were close and spent a lot of time together. A loving trio of support. The humble party consisted of all the usual flair: cake, balloons, presents, and good cheer. My dad bought me a new bike. I rode the hell out of that thing, and a video game. My grandfather, widowed for 15 years now, got me something a little different. He gave me a candle. Now, being a 13-year-old boy, I thought this was an extremely boring present. It was about a foot high and about as thick as my forearm. The wax almost glowed, it was so red. A shining bright shade of brilliance. I dutifully thanked my grandfather and put the candle aside, already forgotten. I spent the rest of my day tricking out my bike with playing cards and playing my new video game. I taped the cards to the spokes so that they sound like a motorcycle. I didn't even think about the candle until I went to bed that night. As I lay down, my dad came into my room and placed the candle by my bedside. He asked me if I wanted him to light it for a little while. I shrugged and said, why not? He came back into my room with a box of matches and lit one. As soon as the flame touched the wick, the room became engulfed in a cool maroon glow. I looked at the flame dancing silently in the air, and my mouth dropped open. The candle had turned the fire the same color as the wax. A grin split my face, and my dad smiled back.
"So cool,"
I whispered. My dad laughed and told me I could leave it on for a little while before I fell asleep. I thanked him and watched as he closed my bedroom door for the night. I sat in the silence of my room, watching the red flame waver and twist on the wick, spilling its strange, beautiful red light across the shadowed walls. The longer I watched, the sleepier I became. Soon, my eyelids became too heavy to hold open, and I fell asleep, the candles still burning beside my bed. I woke up around 2 a.m. I slowly opened my eyes, unsure why I was awake. I rubbed my eyes and realized the candle was still burning. Oddly, it hadn't melted down. It looked like it was lit mere seconds ago. A tiny pool of wax at the base of the wick was the only present residue. Too tired to think much of it, I leaned over to my nightstand and blew the flame out. But it didn't go out. Irritated, I licked my lips and blew harder. The flame shrugged a little, but remained lit. Groaning, thinking maybe this was some trick of my grandfather, I wet my fingers and pinched the flame out of existence. Except when I pulled my fingers away, wincing, the fire continued to burn. And that's when I heard it. It was the sound that had subconsciously woken me up. It was a grisly, slimy sound, like ooze bubbling from an infected boil. It was a slow, wet sound, a sloppy, thick parting of gelatinous goo. My eyes roamed around my room, searching for the source. My brow furrowed in confusion. My heart began to race as I spotted something growing over my door. It bubbled from the doorframe, a pulsing, growing mass of bright red. It looked sticky and hot, a waxy expansion of slimy substance that foamed around the wood like bloody chicken pox. In horror, I watched as it slowly covered my door, layering it with coats of thick, dripping red. In a matter of seconds, I couldn't see my door anymore. The growth had completely overtaken it, a wall of moist goo blocking my exit. I cried out for my dad, a terrified shriek of baffled fear. After a few empty seconds, my eyes trained on the red mass, and I cried out again. No response. Why wasn't he coming to see what was wrong? Why couldn't he hear me? And then, a sick, gurgling groan emitted out of the wall of contorted, waxy ooze. I sat up in bed, heart thundering, as something began to emerge from it. A dripping red hand reached from the shifting mass and pulled itself forward, staining the floor as the thick substance pooled around it. A shoulder emerged next, the hand dragging its body forward into my room. A scream crawling up my throat, I watched as a moaning head materialized out of the vermilion sludge. The waxy muck dripped from its face like a bloody fondue fountain, and its mouth filled with the goo. The thing pulled the rest of its body free with a wet sucking sound and remained on its knees, panting and vomiting red glop onto the floor. Its human-shaped body oozed with the substance, completely coating it like cherry molasses. Oddly, it was odorless, the only smell in the room coming from the tiny puffs of smoke from the ever-burning candle. My eyes were bulging, and my throat clamped shut in fear. My blankets were pulled up to my chin as I sat and watched the dripping creature slowly stand. It faced me, its features drowned in an ocean of slimy wax.
Become the fire. Become the flame.
It gurgled, its voice a wet, choking gasp. It took a step towards me, and I finally screamed, clawing myself away from its looming horror. I pulled myself over to the far side of the bed, desperately searching for escape. It reached the far side of the bed and outstretched a dribbling hand towards me.
Out with us.
It coughed sloppily.
Get away from me!
I cried, jumping from my bed and scrambling to the far corner of the room. I screamed for my dad again, panic throttling my young mind. To my horror, I watched as a second monster began to pull itself from the wall of wax covering my door. I huddled in the corner, crying, howling for help, but no one came. Free from the mass, the second monster rose to its feet, joining the first.
Out with us.
They said in unison. They advanced on me, leaving trails of hot, gooey wax in their wake. I covered my head, screaming, as they towered over me. I shut my eyes, teeth clenched, tears running down my face, and prayed for this nightmare to end. Something wet and powerful grabbed me by the hair and yanked my head up. Gasping, I snapped my eyes open in pain and found myself held in powerless agony as one of the things gripped me in its dripping hand.
Please! Go away!
The monster held me still as the other one leaned down towards me. Its face opened to reveal a gaping red hole. I trembled, feeling hot wax drip onto my head and into my hair, my bladder releasing as fear consumed me. The creatures convulsed and then began to vomit into my face. I gagged as hot red ooze dripped into my nostrils and down my face, completely coating it. I slammed my mouth shut as my vision blackened beneath the sickening substance. I struggled to get away, but the creature holding me gripped me tighter and I was helpless to its strength. The soupy discharge dripped into my ears, and soon, all sound was muffled and muted. Blinded and deafened, I began to panic even more. My lungs began to burn, and I needed to breathe, my nose filling with the vomit. I felt another wave splash into my face, pouring from the creature's gaping maw like a heavy syrup, a pouring gush of unending suffocation. I needed to breathe. I fought off the urge as long as I could, frozen on my knees in helpless submission. I could feel my brain swimming, and my heart thundered in my ears as I slowly drowned underneath a heavy coat of oozing slop. Unable to fight it off any longer, I gasped for air. Immediately, my mouth filled with the wax, exploding down my throat like a burst dam. It was warm and tasteless, like wet Vaseline. The creature vomiting into my mouth retched again, bringing with it another waterfall of slimy goo. I sputtered and spat, trying to fight for a breath of air, but there was simply too much. I began to swallow it, drinking it down in a frantic attempt to find oxygen. As I slurped it down my throat, feeling my stomach fill, the creature gagged up the biggest splash of wax yet, forcefully rocketing it down my throat so hard that my eyes watered and bulged. A scream washed out in wet pain. I felt myself begin to die. Consciousness blinked in and out, and my mind fuzzed over with darkness. The creature's grip on me never faltered, and the torrent of wax continued to rain down into my mouth. My chest ached from lack of oxygen, and I suffered through agony like I've never felt. As the last flames of consciousness extinguished from my body, I felt the iron grip release me and my body slump to the floor. All thought and awareness left me in a wisp of darkness. I don't have any memory of what happened in that darkness. The only thing I can recall is red. So much red. I slowly opened my eyes and felt something stroking my face. As thought and growing alertness returned to me, I looked up and saw my father and grandfather standing over me. Both had smiles and relieved looks in their eyes. I sat up a little and realized I was in bed. I forced consciousness and awareness back into my mind, the terrifying memory of what happened returning with a vengeance. I quickly touched my face, panicked. My hands came away clean. I shot a look at the door and saw no traces of the horrors I had just witnessed. Sunlight trickled in through the window. Had it just been a nightmare? I looked towards the nightstand and swallowed hard. The candles still burned, like it had just been lit. My father smiled at me.
Feeling better?
I licked my lips.
What happened to me?
My father shared a look with my grandfather and then turned back to me.
13 is such an important age for our family. It's when boys become men. It's when we begin to return to the world we came from. It's when we're baptized with the dead milk.
My grandfather nodded and then coughed, covering his mouth with his hand. When he pulled it away, his fingers dripped with thick red liquid. I gasped, eyes growing wide.
What's going on?
My father placed a hand on my shoulder.
Take it easy, son. You'll learn as you grow older. People don't like us much. They think we're strange. But we're not. We're just different because, well, we're not from around here.
I didn't understand, my mind reeling.
What do you mean? What's gonna happen to me?
My father smiled.
One day we will burn with the dead flame. One day we will melt under its eternal warmth.
He leaned down, his eyes glowing.
But until then, we will spread the light of the flame to as many as we can.
Fear boiled in my stomach.
You mean the candle?
He nodded.
Yes, son, the candle. We are called to spread the light, to expose as many as we can to the candle and the experience it births in us. Take it with you wherever you go. Share it with your friends. Let them join us when we are all filled with the dead flame's brilliance. Because it's coming, and when it arrives, it will melt us all in brilliant ecstasy.
My father paused and saw the confused horror in my eyes. He smiled.
Don't be afraid. I was as confused as you are when my father gave me a candle on my 13th birthday.
My grandfather nodded beside him, wiping away a streak of red staining his mouth.
When the dead flame comes to our world, when we all melt in its glory, do you want to be the only one of its creations who hasn't shone in its light to another?
Dad, what are you talking about?
He sighed.
Son, your great-great-grandfather was sent here by the flame to spread its light. We are the first bloodline selected for such an honor. You have been baptized in the dead milk, and now your journey begins. You have been filled with the flame's warmth, and now are called to expose others to it. Burn the candle. Let the dead milk fill your friends, your enemies, your children. Let it fill the world.
Silently, I nodded, too afraid to do otherwise. It's been 10 years since then. After that day, I mentally excommunicated myself from my family. My father didn't mention the dead flame much after that terrifying talk. Occasionally, he'd question me about the candle. He would ask if I had been using it, giving me a knowing look. I would just nod, lying, and tell him I was. In truth, I had no idea what to make of my family's madness. I still don't. I threw away the candle years ago, as soon as I moved out of the house. I didn't talk to my dad much, and it's been ages since I've seen my grandfather. I never recovered mentally from that night, from the insanity I witnessed and that crazy babble my father stuffed my head with. I don't believe him. Of course I don't believe him. We're not the descendants of some weird wax creatures from another dimension. That's crazy. Things like that don't exist. And yet, every once in a while, I think back on that night. I think back to the creatures crawling out of that ooze. And I wonder. Because, you see, I've noticed something. Whenever I'm exposed to an open flame, I get excited. I feel myself drawn to it, and lately, it's become worse. I want to touch it. I want to rub my face in it. I want to let it consume me. I want to melt in it.